We're about a week into Chicago Bears training camp. The pads are on, and we're getting a better sense of who the early standout players are that could be playing bigger roles this upcoming season than we might have expected.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And they have a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. On the show today, 3 players emerging specifically at training camp as guys that are establishing themselves to keep an eye on not only through the rest of the preseason, but likely signs that they'll be major or at least bigger contributors this season than we would have maybe expected them to heading into training camp and heading into the offseason. We'll start with a couple of guys on offense, one wide receiver in particular that Justin Fields has identified, not named Darnell Mooney, that he's building a strong connection with and seeing a lot that he likes at practice. A young offensive lineman emerging and really holding his own in a way that exceeded all of our expectations for how training camp has gone so far. And then a defensive back that's not one of the big rookies that have been getting a lot of the attention, but another player who seems to be firmly in the mix with things that we might not have expected to be right in this position and making so much headway with this new Bears coaching staff. But let's start with the wide receiver position, right? We've been waiting all offseason as this competition has gone on. Which kind of players are going to emerge? What will the depth chart look like after Darnell Mooney? And it seems fairly clear that Byron Pringle's probably going to be your number 2 type guy in that role. But from there, it's open. And it's always going to be a rotation after Darnell Mooney. And so I really like to actually, I'll have Justin Fields himself sort of intro this for us a little bit better because he was asked directly, all right, week into training camp, what are you seeing from these wide receivers? Who are you building who you're building that rapport with, and he picked out a name right away that he went to first and then elaborates on it a little bit more.
Justin, we know you have a good connection with Mooney, but which of the new receivers do you feel like you're developing pretty good chemistry with?
Yeah, I think EQ for sure, Equanimia. I think also Cole, I think he's progressing every day, especially from last year. I think he's just getting better, and Byron for sure also, and then Bayless too. I think those are all guys that I'm getting a lot of reps with and kind of getting to know how they run their routes and stuff like that. So,
You mentioned St. Brown right off the top. Do you find that he is similar to Mooney, that he's just always exactly where you're expecting him to be?
Yeah, and I mean, that's also because he's been in this offense for, a number of years. So, he really doesn't make mistakes when it comes to, running the plays and stuff like that. So he's definitely always in the right spot and kind of knows where to be on certain plays. So he's a weapon in this offense for sure.
I think we can formally declare now that the Equanimia St Brown hype train has left the station. It's not like it's gone off the rails or anything yet, but the train is chugging along now. There's some hype building about what he might be able to do in this Chicago Bears offense. And it's easy to see why. I mean, the dude's listed at 6'5". I think he measured closer to 6'3", 6'4" and some change in there, and ran like a 4.45 40. I mean, he's big, long, and fast. Not necessarily like physically strong in a lot of ways, but right there you can see the physical tools and the playmaking ability. And obviously he comes into Chicago with a great familiarity with the offense and the offensive coordinator, and you can see this opportunity being kind of the thing he's been waiting for to emerge a little bit more in his career. And it's like, okay, here we go. This guy is clearly stepping up in that rotation. I mean, Fields mentioned kind of the other guys we've been talking about a lot as the top 4 in this wide receiving core of Mooney, Pringle, Velus Jones, Equanimia St Brown, likely kind of the main players in the mix right now at training camp. Still time for more guys to emerge and for things to change, but it's trending in this direction towards bigger and bigger things for Equanimia St Brown. It's important to remember that this is his now 5th season in the NFL, and his last 2 seasons have been 9 catches each across the entire season. I mean, he didn't break 100 yards last year. His yardage has gone down from year to year to year, including his yards per reception has also gone down. So let's not pretend that Equanimia St Brown is going to emerge as some 1,000-yard receiver or a big-time difference-making playmaker exactly for the Chicago Bears. But I think it's an encouraging sign, certainly, that he's been able to step up and start building a lot of this chemistry with Justin Fields fairly quickly. It also makes sense, though, that Equanimia St Brown would be the early favorite in training camp, given that he is going to be so far ahead in the offense and the understanding. Fields talking about how he doesn't really make, that Equanimia St Brown doesn't really make mistakes in practice because he knows the plays and he knows where he's supposed to be. And so what's going to be critical for Brown, I think, here is that he sustains it, that he entered training camp with a head start and is doing everything we would like to see with that head start. It's not as though he's completely stalled from that head start in this offense, but let's see how other players compete and push to maybe start to catch up to that. It's not to say that he's going to fall off completely and not be a part of this offense at all, but I'm curious to see how well he's able to sustain this, because you may remember he did not make the 53-man roster to start the season in Green Bay last season. The team brought him back during the year and kept him in the rotation from there, but Luke Getsy, the Bears offensive coordinator, made it a point to sign Equanimia St Brown and bring him in first, even before they signed Byron Pringle this offseason. And so I think there's some real evidence as to why you could see success for him this season, and you could see why maybe it's a precipitous early start to training camp, but he has to sustain it and really keep building on that chemistry with Justin Fields, and maybe the Bears can get a little bit more out of him than the Green Bay Packers were able to with, guys that Aaron Rodgers liked more ahead of him on the depth chart there. He's not the only young offensive player at some of these key positions starting to emerge in what are otherwise important and very undecided position battles. We'll look at the young offensive linemen taking the team and the offensive line by storm so far next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by our friends at Built Bar, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars ever. They are delicious. They taste like candy bars. They're all soft, easy to chew, covered in 100% real chocolate. And their Built Bar puffs taste like a chocolate-covered marshmallow. I mean, they are incredible. They've got a cookie dough flavor as well that has pieces of cookie dough in the Built Puff. But every single flavor of Built Bars and Built Puffs are low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It is a sweet, delicious treat that's somehow also good for you. It sounds like it's too good to be true, but I've been eating them for literally more than a year now. Every single day I have a Built Bar, and it's one of my favorite parts of the day. It's like cheating. It really is. You got to try it for yourself. Head on over to Built.com, enter in that promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. We heard the first hype train of the offseason really get going at OTAs, and I wondered how well this would continue into training camp and whether it was not just an experiment and a rotation thing at OTAs that might drop off a little bit at training camp, especially once the pads get on. But right now, there is no stopping the Braxton Jones hype train. 2 trains leaving the station for this Bears offense. And Jones in particular is surprising as, the 5th round pick out of Southern Utah University came to Chicago Bears as the first offensive lineman they drafted and the one they seemed to prioritize and rave about the most. So there was a lot to like about him as a prospect. But we kind of thought coming out of an FCS school, I believe they're FCS, like Division 1A school, not a Power 5, not anything like that, that there would be a developmental curve, and that if he were to become a good offensive lineman, it likely wouldn't be right away. Right? There's going to be that level of competition adjustment to the NFL that is hard to do quickly and early on in your career. And yet, OTAs, he gets in above Tevin Jenkins, rotating in at left tackle. And we're like, okay, here we go. That's interesting. Let's keep an eye on that. And then comes to training camp, and they sign Riley Reef as the veteran. And it's like, oh, okay, well, there's their veteran left tackle. He's going to start at left tackle. Back to the bench for you, Braxton Jones. And then Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borum will compete at right tackle. The Tevin Jenkins situation has since devolved. But even separately from Jenkins's likely to be traded situation, Braxton Jones seems like he's not necessarily beating out Riley Reef, but giving the Bears enough confidence in him that they don't need to keep Riley Reef at at left tackle. Freudian slip there to what I was going to say, that like now at practice with the pads on, for a little while there, it was Riley Reef at left tackle, Larry Borum at right tackle. And that looked like probably what your starting lineup was going to be, just given the experience that those two guys have at those positions, and that Tevin Jenkins was not participating. But now at practice on Wednesday, and I think they might have done this on Tuesday too, but for sure on Wednesday with pads on, they moved Riley Reef to right tackle and put Braxton Jones in at left tackle. The Bears are essentially saying, we're going to start our two best offensive tackles. Some combination of Riley Reef, Larry Borum, Braxton Jones, and maybe Tevin Jenkins, but probably not Tevin Jenkins at this point. And so, like I said, we assumed it was going to be Reef and Borum because a fifth-round rookie out of Southern Utah. Doesn't happen too often that player beats out a veteran or is just even in any way ready to start as a rookie. But the fact that he was good enough and has been good enough at left tackle that they said, you know what, we're going to move Riley Reef over to right tackle and have him practice on that side so Braxton Jones can take, I think, all of the first team reps at left tackle. I don't know that for sure, but if not all, most of the first team reps at left tackle, because maybe right now he and Reef are looking like your two best tackles. That's a very, very encouraging sign. It makes me kind of step back and say, okay, how has he gotten here so quickly? You know, not that it came out of nowhere, not that there wasn't some optimism that he could do well, but like this is exceeding expectations even farther than we would have hoped. And so I wanted to go back and hear what one of the Bears scouts said about Braxton Jones when they first drafted him. This is one of their area scouts, David Williams, talking to the media immediately after the draft about some of the things they liked about Braxton Jones as a prospect right on draft day.
Your sense of where Braxton's greatest strengths are for the next level?
I'd say just his broad frame, his long arms. He's got 35-inch arms, and just having a moldable frame and also his bend, his lower body, his footwork, his bend. I think those translate pretty well.
Braxton said that you guys worked him out on Monday in Utah. What were you confirming on that, or what did you see that kind of stood out or maybe made a difference in the scouting report?
Well, I think these draft picks are investments, so just to get to know them a little bit better, especially coming from a small program, you just want to see how they translate to our level. So even seeing him in Mobile, interviewing him in Mobile, that was one test where it's like, okay, he's used to playing FCS competition, but now he gets to play against the big boys. So just that one last confirmation was helpful for us.
Is he the kind of talent have the skill set to be a day one starter or compete for a position, do you think?
He has the talent to compete for a position for sure. You know, he's like I said, he's got the bend, he's got the footwork, he has the prerequisite length and frame that you look for in a tackle. He's played left tackle, but has some versatility in what he can do.
So with a little bit of hindsight, again, you can start to see some of the green flags about Braxton Jones coming out of the draft. And it's an interesting parallel to what we did on the podcast 2 days ago, about Tevin Jenkins and how with his trade situation, the red flags were there after the draft when you heard his college coach, Mike Gundy, talk about Tevin Jenkins. We played some of that audio, and it's really revealing, I think, with that hindsight a couple of days ago on the podcast. If you haven't heard that one about Tevin Jenkins, go back and take a listen, because I thought it was revelatory in a way that I don't think a lot of other people are talking about a ton right now. But it's sort of the reverse with Braxton Jones with some hindsight, that you can hear, some of the physical tools there and how great it sounds. But then when you think back again, similarly with Jenkins, that I forgot, it's like you forgot about some of the things that happened like right at and around draft day, because it's just a flurry of like all the draft picks and everything to learn about all these players. Right before the draft, the Bears brought in Braxton Jones for like a one last private workout. Like it was like 2 or 3 days before the draft to bring him in and get him to see him one more time and really work with him up close and personal. And like we heard that came out right after the draft that the Bears had done so, but then it kind of slips under the radar and you forget about it a little bit. But it like very clearly, I think the Bears saw something and made him then a priority, that he excelled at the Senior Bowl practices, looked like he belonged with, Division I, SEC, Big Ten, Power 5 players, Alabama defensive linemen, Michigan defensive linemen, big-time opponents that, like any other prospect faced, he looked just as good and just as physical and belonged with all those other top guys. And so I think the Bears really had this extreme level of confidence in Braxton Jones. Not that that means he would come in and be handed a starting opportunity, no, but perhaps there was more reason to be confident in him than you might be for a regular fifth-round pick. Now, like with Equanimia St Brown, it's still early in training camp. The pads have only been on for a couple of days now. The fact that he's still earning more reps as the pads have gone on is a good sign for him, but preseason games will say a lot, and as the weeks go on, it's an opportunity for Reef to get more up to speed and show why he's a longtime veteran starter in the NFL. There's more time for Larry Borum to show his physicality and why he was able to find playing time early in his career as a rookie, fifth-round pick last year as well. And I mean, maybe if they somehow sort this out with Tevin Jenkins, there is time for him to put the pads on and remind everybody why he was a second-round pick that a lot of people viewed as a first-round talent. So we're not making Braxton Jones our week 1 left tackle starter just yet. But the fact that he's still there and still at the front of that line, even this far into training camp, which is not like far, but farther than we might have thought he would have remained in that rotation, says a lot about Braxton Jones. Whether he's your week 1 starter or not, I think it's a very, very bright future for what he can bring for this Bears offensive line. The early breakouts at training camp haven't just been on the offensive side of the ball, even though that's where a lot of our attention and maybe concern is at this point. But there's a defensive back in particular that keeps getting those starting reps, and we weren't necessarily expecting him to do so, that he's kind of shaking up the lineup in a similar way as Braxton Jones, just defensive side of the ball. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at BetterHelp. BetterHelp is here to help you feel better. It's a therapy service, and it's not a crisis line. It's not about self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. I do online therapy every single week. I meet with a therapist virtually over a video call just like this, and it does wonders for my mental health. It's so good for you. Even if you don't feel like you have like terrible, drastic, diagnosable mental health conditions or whatever it might be, like it still is just good for you and feels good and it helps. It's BetterHelp. It helps you feel better. It's right there in the name. You can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. If you don't want to be on camera, you can just do it right over the phone. And it's as easy as just a few clicks on your laptop or your cell phone. With therapy, sometimes it can take a few tries to find the right therapist for you, but BetterHelp makes it really easy and actually free to change your therapists if you need to. If you're not vibing perfectly with the first one you get, they'll help you find the one that is right for you. It's really a great way to invest in yourself. You can visit their website and read all the different testimonials that they post all the time as well. I mean, so many people have been getting BetterHelp that they're actually recruiting more therapists in all 50 states. They have a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. We'll see if the Bears end up getting some better help in their secondary from a player that maybe we didn't write off, but just sort of assumed that they wouldn't necessarily be in the starting rotation here. And yet, a full week plus into training camp, he's still there and might be changing some of their plans with other players. Because when training camp first started, right, the Bears were rotating Kyler Gordon, the rookie second-round pick, in the slot. And it was kind of like, okay, they want to see if he can play some multiple positions here and maybe then eventually be able to follow wide receivers into the slot when they go in pre-snap motion, as opposed to passing some of those routes off and stuff. And so when they would practice with Kyler Gordon in the slot, Kendall Vildor would come in as the outside cornerback, which kind of makes sense. Like if you're thinking about the depth chart, we were thinking it would be, Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon would be your outside starters, and then Tavon Young or maybe Thomas Graham would be your nickel, and then your first cornerback off the bench on the outside, if something were to get hurt or whatever, would probably be Kendall Vildor. But we expected Kendall Vildor to be that number 4. And instead, they continued to work Kyler Gordon in the slot and have Kendall Vildor play outside cornerback to the point now where you could have your week 1 starting lineup be Kendall Vildor and Jalen Johnson on the outside and have Kyler Gordon be essentially a full-time slot cornerback in his rookie season. Still a lot of time, and we're not ready to write that in pen or in stone or anything just yet, but Kendall Vildor has been a guy that has impressed Matt Eberflus and this new Bears coaching staff. And like we've seen with Tevin Jenkins, the holdovers from the last regime, they're not owed anything by this staff. They will move on from you as soon as you deserve it, or as soon as they deem that they want to move on from you. So it wasn't like Kendall Vildor comes in with any kind of built up, credibility, for lack of a better word. Yes, he started last season and there's tape of him, but it's all fresh slate for him. He comes in on a fresh slate and has really been endearing himself to this new coaching staff. Here's Matt Eberflus talking about what they've seen out of Kendall Vildor and why they liked him enough to keep giving him first team reps and kind of move Kyler Gordon into the slot a lot more than we thought.
Coach, you talked about Kyler being in the nickel and part of that just being about getting your best 3 corners on the field. What is that you all like so much about Kendall Vildor? He's a kid who's been here for some years now. What do you all like about him that includes him in that group of your best 3 right now?
Yeah, I like his competitiveness, what he's shown in this camp so far. He's competing. He's put a nice couple thuds on some runners, like I was saying, that corners tackle here. And that's an important part of it. And he's showing that he's able to do that. Now, we haven't tackled yet, and we haven't had, live drills and all that stuff. We all have to exhibit that, because there's no house guests here, right? We don't have 10 guys doing it and 1 guy not doing it. That ain't the way we operate. We don't do it like that. So that's why you'll see over in our drills with the DBs, you'll see us every day. They got tackling drills, right? And we cover. We do both. So it's an important part of that, and he has shown that. And he's going to have to continue to show that, and he is doing a good job.
It's not to say yet that Kendall Vildor is going to completely unseat Kyler Gordon from any outside role and make Kyler Gordon sort of the number 3 cornerback, and with Vildor being the 2 and Jalen Johnson being the 1. But clearly he's doing a lot that Eberflus likes. I mean, he talked a lot about the physicality and the tackling and being in the right place and a lot of the hits principle type things. And when you think back to Kendall Vildor's season last year, right, there were definitely a lot of rough spots. He did not have a good season. He didn't really play like what I would consider a starting caliber cornerback for a lot of the time. But it felt like with Vildor last year, right, it was frustrating because it seemed like a lot of it was sort of like communication and mental type stuff. It wasn't as though he was just too small sometimes, so big wide receivers would just physically dominate him, or it wasn't like he was too slow and couldn't keep up with fast receivers, but it was sometimes he would be in the wrong place, or he wouldn't pick up a route that he was supposed to when it's being passed off by another player, or he might bite on a double move, or some kind of miscommunication. It felt like largely between the ears. Not so much that he's dumb or didn't know the playbook, but it's just, being a young player thrown into the fire like that, having a lot on your plate, he was still, I think, catching up and getting up to speed in that area. And so it could be conceivable then that he comes into now year 3 with all of those game experiences under his belt and a lot of learning moments and learning opportunities there. And all of a sudden it starts to click a little bit more, especially if maybe the new coaching staff seems to be asking him to do less. That's been kind of the theme here from Alan Williams and Matt Eberflus. It's a more simple style of coverage and defense on the back end. The Fangio defense under Sean Desai asks the cornerbacks and all the secondary players and the linebackers, the coverage defenders, asks them to often, read the route concept that the offense is running and oftentimes change your coverage after the snap, depending on what the receivers in front of you are going to do. And Matt Eberflus is a little bit more, everything's happening in front of you, plays there, and you just have to read and react. It cuts down on some of the mental processing that may have been the struggle more for Kendall Vildor. So it does make sense that he could have an easier time in this defense and do all the physical things right that the coaching staff wants and play himself into a bigger role this season than we might have anticipated. I would have thought him to be mostly a bench guy that you would only have on the field defensively if you were having extra DBs in a dime package or if you had an injury or something like that, otherwise being a special teams player. But now there's a role for real snaps in this defense. And if I had to guess, there's still time for a lot of this to change, and maybe Tavon Young emerges as they're going to play their best 3 cornerbacks, like you kind of heard in the question there. And Jalen Johnson's going to be one, and Kyler Gordon's going to be the other. It's a question of, is Kendall Vildor your next best cornerback as an outside cornerback versus Tavon Young as your next best cornerback in the slot, versus if Thomas Graham can get healthy and back on the field, can he climb back up in that competition? I would think at this point, assuming the Kyler Gordon development goes as expected, what I would think the cornerback depth chart will look like is when you're in your base defense with your 3, 4, 7 men in the box, and you have 2 cornerbacks and 2 safeties on the field, your 2 cornerbacks on the outside will be Kyler Gordon and Jalen Johnson. And then I would bet then when you go into the nickel and bring a 5th defensive back, another cornerback on the field, that Kendall Vildor will come on the field as your 3rd cornerback, but he will play on the outside. And then in those nickel situations, Kyler Gordon would then move to the inside and be the slot cornerback. Essentially, Kyler Gordon would play both the slot and the outside, and whenever he moves into the slot, Kendall Vildor would then fill in for him on the outside. That's kind of my prediction right now based on how things have been going at practice with those 2 players. Not that Gordon is going to be a slot-only player, but he will be the first choice in the slot. And then when he is then in the slot, it would be Vildor essentially coming off the bench, but playing that outside cornerback spot. Still time for this cornerback competition to play out further. Still time for the offensive tackle combinations to change up further. They've certainly been trying a lot of rotations there. And still time for other wide receivers to emerge with Justin Fields. The preseason games will say a lot. The training camp practices as we keep going will say a lot. And even as we get into the season, there could still be some rotation, hopefully not on the offensive line, but more rotation at wide receiver and maybe cornerback as they try and figure out what those lineups are going to be for the long haul. However these battles keep changing and playing out, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for that second listen, the Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day. Locked On Bulls, Locked On Cubs, Locked On Blackhawks. Your Chicago sports are covered here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So I hope you'll check them out. And then, of course, come back for some more Locked On Bears and come back for another opportunity to bear down.